Thank you. I'm humbled and honored to be here. I grew up in Ventura County, that's my home, and I've called Santa Barbara County my home since 2004, so to just witness my childhood home and the home I've chosen undergo so many events recently, I, like you, want to be able to help, and I'm hoping that some of what I've learned from just the voices of disaster survivors over the past 12 years can help us just think of creative ways that we can continue to support our community in the long run. So I'm going to try to do that today. I like to start, I've learned things from my own research and from the research of colleagues, and there's just some important things to consider, and a lot of this Ryan has already covered, but we'll kind of get at it in a different way. So it used to be that we believed in the field that, okay, trauma, there's going to be a whole, like following a disaster, the majority of people are going to have post-traumatic stress disorder. But as Ryan pointed out, serious psychological harm occurs in only a minority of survivors. So this is a chart, and this is looking at disruptions in functioning over the long term. This is research that has been done across adult samples, child samples, following a variety of disasters. And the good news is that, as Ryan said, 2/3 or 3/4 of us are going to be in the resilience or the recovery group. So of course we feel these natural emotions that Ryan talked about in the aftermath. We're human and we feel the grief of others, and we have a lot, we're dealing with our emotions, but we tend to be able to continue functioning, and that's the vast majority of people. Or if we start to have some impairments in functioning, we recover. The vast majority of people who have that recover. But there are some people who may have delayed reactions, and that's often because, disasters impart a cascading series of stressors. There's what's happened in the impact, and we're in the recoil phase from the impact, but there's also stressors that get set off in dealing with insurance companies and rebuilding and all those efforts, and sometimes that can compound and people can have some delayed reactions. And then there are some people that will have chronic impairments in functioning following this. And so my whole focus of my research and what I hope to do is to help get the most people as possible in the resilience and recovery group, and then to help support with the help of our community, the people that might be in the delayed or chronic area. And so who is most at risk for serious consequences? So it really depends on how you were doing before a disaster hit. So if you were already contending with more worry than you needed, or serious levels of depression or sadness or hopelessness or substance use issues, then you're going to have a harder time coping after the disaster. Also, the amount of stressors that you were having to deal with in your life will impact how you're doing after. In terms of age, we know that children tend to be at greater risk than adults once they get to a certain age. Infants and toddlers, they're not so aware, but with school age and above, children tend to be at more risk than adults. So our preparation for disasters and our prior experience with them also affects how we will handle afterwards. And what we found is interesting in the fact that if it's the same kind of thing, like we as a community went through the Jesucita and T fires, and so because of that, we learned some ways to cope. We often knew exactly what we would take if we were evacuating because we've gone through this before. But the mudslide was something different. Like maybe, I know in La Conchita we had it, but it was a small group of us compared to how many of us went through Jesucita and T. And so that can cause greater risk because we hadn't developed the coping skills for those. And so that's what preparation and prior exposure. So if it's a different kind of thing than we're used to, it causes us more stress in the aftermath. And then, of course, it's the extent of disaster exposure and losses, seeing this, being there on the front line, seeing things, having your house destroyed, all those most direct things naturally would put you at greater risk to just have challenges in in functioning. And then, as Ryan mentioned, social support is so important to consider, and we're going to talk about a lot of concrete ways to do that, and we have to think of it in the long term, because what we find in the research following so many different disasters is that there's a lot of initial outpouring. We see wonderful acts of human kindness and generosity, but then it tends to go away after a few weeks. And there's the people that have been most severely impacted who are like, no, like this is still a part of my life 1 year, 2 years later, and people can start feeling disappointment, feeling as if the media, the community may have moved on. And so we have to make sure that we are sustaining our levels of social support as a community for the long haul after this, that we keep this momentum going. So we did some work with some children and families, 500 children and families in the floods in Texas before this hurricane. And so we asked about a whole bunch of different experiences in a disaster. There could be evacuation or loss of utilities or having your school affected or your neighborhood affected. And we compared this to how they were doing approximately a year after the flood. And so we found that there tends to be this threshold effect, in that these experiences in combination, because they often don't occur in isolation. If you've lost your home, you're more likely to have been sick or injured in the disaster. That these are really the core experiences that made it so that people were experiencing more symptoms of depression a year later or symptoms of anxiety a year later. So these tended to be the critical items that kind of set off. A lot of us, we may know somebody or we've seen this on the news, but we can feel a little, yes, we may have evacuated because of the smoke, but we weren't as directly impacted as others. And we tend to do fine, but it's these experiences. So we really have to support people with this. Did I skip something? Okay. So certain mental health issues to consider post-disaster. What I've noticed is that we really need to screen for a variety of issues. If kids or families are coming in, there's so many reactions that people can have. People have often over-focused on post-traumatic stress disorder. They think trauma, PTSD, and when we were doing our studies in Puerto Rico following Hurricane George, we found out that was actually the least common disorder we found 2 years after it, because you can really see long-term impact. We actually found, as Ryan was saying, with children, that we were finding higher levels, clinical levels of separation anxiety, depression, social phobia. So we have to, especially I'm speaking to the mental health providers out there, really look for a variety of reactions to distress. And this also depends upon the culture of the person. And so we were in Puerto Rico, so we knew to screen for ataques de nervios. And we found that was actually the most common thing. And so if we're only looking at it through our cultural lens, we may miss cultural expressions of distress that we really need to understand and help support in children and families. And then what we found in the long term is that because of changes and stresses in the family, in the longer term, some kids were at greater risk for what we call clinically externalizing reactions to stress. So that's more like you're feeling stressed and you act out on the environment. You might be more irritable, angry, defiant. You might engage in more delinquent behavior, hang out with more deviant peers. Not every study finds it, but when they do find it, it's usually because there's more stress in the family. Families are so busy focused on all the things that they need to do to recover and rebuild that there might be less monitoring of kids. They might start hanging out with the wrong peer group. So that's something for us to consider as a community as well as we think about how to support children and families. So this is a model of, and I'll walk you through it. It looks a little more complex than it actually is. It's very logical. So just kind of understanding how people, what are the factors that affect whether somebody's going to have a mental health, a clinical level of mental health issues in the long-term post-disaster. All their emotional reactions that Ryan talked about are very normal and common in the first few weeks, but if they start impairing your life and your ability to relate to others and to do your work and to do school efficiently, then we're talking about when it reaches impairment over here. So obviously it's what you bring. The top talks about pre-existing characteristics. So how people were functioning before, your level of self-esteem, how your family was doing before, whether or not you were dealing with anxiety or depression beforehand. Then there's the exposure to traumatic events. And so the extent of life threat during the event is a strong predictor of who might get post-traumatic stress reactions disorder. And then the extent of loss and disruption after the event. And so we know that that group is at higher risk. And then we all try to process and cope with this. And we have positive ways we might be coping with things, and sometimes we have some negative ways by maybe perhaps relying too much on substances or ruminating over something or a lot of self-blame. So we try to deal with these events, and of course we want to increase the use of healthy, adaptive coping skills, and Ryan gave some excellent ones, and decrease the negative. But we also know that there's so much in the characteristics of the recovery environment, and that's where the rest of my talk is going to focus on, because what that affect this. So there's things that families can do, schools can do, communities to do. The extent that we support people can help mitigate the risk for long-term post-traumatic stress disorder or clinical levels of depression. So we're going to talk about social support in those things and how to help us cope with the major life stressors that tend to come following the disaster. Before we move on to that, one of our major things as mental health professionals and health professionals is to do no harm. And so what we've learned from doing this research is that sometimes our well-meaning intentions did not work out. Like sometimes the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So some of the psychological interventions that used to be really advocated in the aftermath are now contraindicated. That's psychological debriefing at a group level. We don't do that anymore, and so instead it's important if you have volunteers come into schools or into your community agency, or offering that they're trained in, at least in this initial aftermath, in psychological first aid, like Santa Barbara Response Network is to have their volunteers are trained in that, or a similar approach, like American Red Cross has a disaster mental health training, the National Association for School Psychologists does too, because there's just things we know about trying to support the natural ability to recover. Our human body and mind is made to be resilient. It has its natural healing processes, and we want to support that in the initial few weeks, because what we're feeling right now is a normal reaction to extraordinary events. And so talking about it, meeting as a group, this is helpful, but certain interventions have not been helpful. And so if you're a head of an agency or work at a school, you want to make sure that you know who your mental health volunteers are before they come in, and make sure that they're trained in one of these newer models. So psychological first aid, American Red Cross training. And those should be the initial volunteers in the aftermath. If some mental health professionals are trained in this and some are not, if they're not, they can still be volunteers, but in the long term, for the people that will need therapy in the long term, that's the appropriate place for that. We all can support. We don't all have to do it all in the first 3 weeks. There's ways we can support our community for the next 2 to 5 years in helping do this. So you can have them on your referral list. So now I want to get into some concrete ways to support our community. And so the first thing I've learned from doing this work and talking with survivors is that, and I can't emphasize this enough, is that we really have to think long-term in our support. When we were in Puerto Rico, we found clinical levels, so this is diagnosable levels where it's impairing children's functioning, ability to succeed in school or have relationships 18 months post-disaster, comparing kids who were highly exposed in the hurricane to kids who were not, maybe in a safer place on the island for that hurricane. And so we really have to think 2 or 3 years post-disaster, so plan for that. And I want to encourage us to do this both individually and as a community. And so when I think individually, I'm thinking of my friends, the people I know. Like We were checking in with them right away to make sure they're safe. How are you doing? And offering support. We cannot forget to keep doing this. And we have to check in regularly. And sometimes people ask me like, well, I don't know what to say. And I'm like, it's not about saying. There's no words. It's being with somebody and it's bearing witness and giving them a hug and just being there to listen. Listening is the most powerful intervention we have. Like, just listen. You don't have to know the right words. So please do that individually for the people that you're thinking of. And we can do this as a community by having these remembrance events. Like we did this following the Isla Vista mass murder, having remembrance events at various stages throughout the first 2 years to say that, hey, we're a community, we care, we remember. And so around anniversaries, when we asked our university students what they wanted these remembrance events, and we asked about a whole bunch of different events that were offered in the initial aftermath of that tragedy, and the ones that they rated as most helpful were the ones that they created. And so obviously there's stuff that we come in as an idea, we have memorials, we do that stuff, but they doing having the yoga on the beach, or the paddle out was the most. So if you have an idea, you might be able to engage other people and you can just initiate it. Some people really like the arts-based activities that were focused on grief and remembrance and coming together around that. Some people wanted to do something more physical. They asked for therapy dogs and seeing puppies and remembering life is good. So you can think of a lot of creative ways and somebody will want to join you in with that. So a variety of wellness supports can be helpful. And I want to encourage us to think beyond the individual. So I always like to show this for children. We know that we're all embedded in different spheres of influence. And so, children, their development is affected. There's the individual, but they're surrounded by peers, a family network, a school network, and a broader community network. And so now for this next part of my talk, I'm going to talk about things that we can do at each of those levels. So this is also some of the research we did in Puerto Rico, but we've also found this consistently across other studies, is number one, besides the disaster exposure, the number one family thing that affects how kids are going to do is their own parents' mental health. How parents are coping with their distress really impacts how children are going to handle theirs. And so, parents, take care of yourself. All the stuff that Ryan was saying, we've got to do that. You just have to be aware that they see it. Even when we don't think they see it, they see it. And so, if you're feeling stressed and overwhelmed, please be proactive and get support, because that's probably the number one way that you can help your children. We also noticed that we asked about family environment in Puerto Rico and here following the Jesucita and Tea fires. And we found that there were some similarities in parents and kids' views, and there were some differences. And so each family member has their own view about how everybody is doing. And so mental health providers in the audience, please think about and support the whole family and get the different perspectives afterwards. Kids notice things that parents thought that perhaps they didn't notice. So just keep that in mind. Obviously, we know that a positive parent-child relationship is a protective factor in life in general, and if it's not good, that's a risk factor in general, but it becomes even more important post-disaster. We found that kids, even at higher levels of exposure, like the ones the most impacted, if they had a really good, solid parent-child relationship, then they were less likely to have clinical levels of distress 2 years after the hurricane. And so, community, I was thinking, what are some tangible things we can do to support this? We could support families. We know it takes a village to raise a child. And so, parents are stressed. They're having to deal with insurance companies, rebuilding, that might cause more arguments in the family. It's just natural. And they may not, there might not be safe places for kids to play. They don't know what to do. So the extent that we as community groups can organize safe, fun events for children and youth that can free up parents' time. So parents are like, okay, my kid can go laugh and do pajama dance party at the gym with the school or have a fun movie night. Number one, that helps kids because they laugh again and they play again, and that's developmentally normal and is protective against depression. But it also frees up parents to have a date night if they want, because as you notice, my next part says parents' relationship quality really affected this too, and so supporting that they can support their partner relationship is important. Or it can give them more free, unencumbered time to just have the time to deal with the stuff they have to deal with. We just have to think pragmatically like that. And then also, free or low-cost fun events for parents and children to do together. Parents are stressed, overwhelmed, there can be this cognitive load, and so they might not be planning the fun art activities they used to plan for their young kids or thinking about this, but if there's some event in the community and it's free or low cost and it's like, let's do some art together, like that is helpful, and taking the time to do those things is helpful in support and making sure that you're in the more resilient or recovery trajectory compared to the other ones. Schools. I'm going to spend some time on this, but I'm going to defer to the expertise of Dr. Gevirtz on this. But what we know is that when we're trying to support kids, that schools are the best public mental health approach to doing this, because you can target all the kids in the schools. And so one of my ideas, we often do school-wide screenings in general for mental health, but it's particularly needed post an event like this, because we don't want kids to suffer with anxiety or depression long term. And so you could do school-wide screenings for disaster exposure and mental health symptoms regularly over the 2 years, and then refer the kids that are showing clinical levels. We understand, like, we're going to have good days, bad days, there's going to be transitory emotions, but if there's clinical levels of impairment, we want to help as early as possible, because we know that anxiety can cause, and depression can cause impairments in concentration that makes it difficult to learn. If you're feeling hopeless every day, it's hard to focus on your schoolwork if you're so worried about your family. So we want to support these kids early on before it starts affecting their academic adjustment. So that's one of my ideas for this, is that we can screen and refer to all the people who want to support, like that we have a community of mental health professionals that want to help this community, and we can do that. One of the things they find consistently across studies is that one of the best things to help kids do well after is for schools to reopen ASAP. It's one of the biggest protective factors, that structure, that routine, being back with their friends, having opportunity to play. It's the biggest help for kids. More than anything I can do as a clinician, it's that. So even if they're not in the same location, just trying to have a similar routine is really helpful. So how we can help support our communities, especially the ones in Montecito that were affected the most, open and support their kids. Also, from talking with teachers following 9/11, is that they often don't feel like they're prepared to help after this. They want to, but they don't necessarily. They felt unprepared before, but there's a lot of trainings after, so you feel more prepared after. It'd be great if we all felt prepared before. But what they wanted when they said, like, this is what I want, they want to know how to identify mental health concerns in their students, and they want to know skills appropriate for their role. Like, they know they're not clinicians, but they want to know, like, how do I talk about this? How do I support this? When do I refer on? So those basic things can be very helpful in supporting teachers doing that. And what we know is that survivors, when they go to their support network, they go to people who are already existing in their network. If you weren't seeing a therapist beforehand, you're not calling me in the immediate aftermath to talk about your depression necessarily. Kids will go to trusted adults that were already in their lives. So teachers are the most common of that outside of their parents or maybe other family members. And so helping teachers be able to do that, but also recognizing that our teachers were impacted. And sometimes it could just be like all they can do is deal with their own recovery and rebuilding efforts and get through the school day. And maybe not all teachers are able to help with this despite wanting to. Obviously all teachers care about kids, that's why they go into the profession, but we have to recognize that we've all been affected, and so maybe this isn't the right time for everybody to help. And then community. Almost done. So what we find, we started to do more physical health research after that, and then after disasters like hurricanes, and they found that children are at increased risk for sedentary activities post-disaster, and it's for a variety of reasons. Number one, there's not a lot of parks open. Parks and play areas could be damaged or destroyed, so there may not be safe places for kids to go play. Parents can be so busy, especially those who are having to rebuild their homes, maybe having to work more jobs because of economic losses and rebuilding. So kids might be in front of screens more often. So one of the things that we can do that's really tangible to help our community is to try to clean up and repair the parks and the play areas and recreational areas so that kids can go back to that as soon as possible. Because we know them playing, them laughing, them resuming as normal life as possible can help afterwards. And we know sedentary activities can lead to higher BMI in the long run and other physical health stuff, so we just want to prevent that. And then just in general, we're a community that we're the fabric in which the families and schools and kids are in, and so we want to think about how we as a group can support it. So if you're in a position of thinking about how can we offer free or low-cost community events, and so we talked about some of them. I talked about pajama dance party or whatever, but there's also things about like scholarships for participating in sports or art classes or things like that, because finances can be stretched, obviously, like in rebuilding and recovery, and so offering free and low-cost scholarships can help. The things we always do in the community that we know helps kids are needed more in the aftermath. So mentors for youth, we know that helps in general, but there can be more of a need after a disaster. There was already wait lists for mentors in Big Brothers Big Sisters or CADA or other places before, but this is a way we can help as well. So social support in the aftermath is long. We need to do it in the long term, and so these are some ideas. And then just my final caveat is to try to make sure that the information we provide kids is accurate and delivered in a developmentally appropriate way. It's more important than the speed of information, because there can be rumors that cause a lot of distress, and then kids say to other kids on the playground, and so accurate information. This is one of my favorite resources. So if you remember anything, you can find everything under the sun about helping children and families and schools and teachers. So many free resources in Spanish and English and other languages, downloadable books where it talks about how a kid, just stories so that you can kind of normalize reactions following a disaster. So National Child Traumatic Stress Network, I kind of did a screenshot of just wildfire, but they have it for every single traumatic event that you can have. So just remember this website. You can forget everything I said, remember this. So just in closing, I wanted to just give my appreciation to the people who have shared their stories with us. Their parents and children and youth, and so they've shared with us these experiences in hoping that we can help other communities in recovery following a disaster, and so we learn from them, and so I want to thank them in Puerto Rico, Santa Barbara, Texas, many other places. And then we'll have questions at the end. I had to put that in there, and just, there's hope. We will rebuild, we will recover, hope is the best protection.